if one day you saw a house on your street that wasn't supposed to be there? A house with no records, no history, no past. But the moment you step inside, it remembers you. Some doors should never be opened, and some places never forget. The house that wasn't there. The vanishing address. The first time Eleanor Price realized something was wrong, it was a rainy Friday evening. She was exhausted from work, her mind still tangled in the mess of deadlines and half-written reports. The streets of Boston were slick with rain, the headlights of passing cars reflecting in broken puddles along the sidewalk. She had just pulled out her phone to order an Uber when her eyes flickered to a small, tucked-away alley between two tall apartment buildings. And that's when she saw it. A house. A Victorian-style house, deep red bricks, intricate white trim along the windows, and a dimly lit porch. It shouldn't have been there. Eleanor had walked down this street every day for 7 years, and she had never seen that house before. A memory that didn't exist. Frowning, she took a few hesitant steps toward the alley. The closer she got, the more wrong it felt. The house wasn't old and abandoned, nor was it newly built. It looked lived in, as if it had always been there, as if it had been part of the city for decades. A flickering street lamp hummed above her, casting long shadows on the wet pavement. How had she never noticed this before? She reached for her phone, intending to check Google Maps. Maybe she had just been unobservant all these years. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hands were trembling. When she typed in the address, she saw on the rusted metal plaque by the door, 47 Langley Street. The screen loaded for a moment, then showed nothing. No results, no history, no records of any house at that address. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. She turned back toward the main road, expecting to see the usual row of brownstone buildings, the neon glow of the bakery on the corner, the familiar world she had known all her life. But for a brief, heart-stopping moment, everything felt distorted. The air was thick, heavier than before. The rain, which had been falling steadily, was now eerily silent. No cars honked, no footsteps echoed. It was as if she had stepped into a different version of the city. She looked back at the house. The front door was slightly open. A decision that couldn't be undone. Eleanor knew she had two choices. 1, turn away, walk home, forget about it. 2, step inside. Find out why this house wasn't supposed to exist. Her pulse pounded. A strange sense of familiarity washed over her, like an old memory just out of reach. She felt as if she had seen this house before, but she couldn't place where or when. Against every logical instinct, she stepped forward. The moment her foot touched the porch, a wave of dizziness crashed over her. Her vision blurred. The world around her flickered. Then, just as suddenly as it came, it was gone. She steadied herself, gripping the wooden railing, her breathing shallow. Something was waiting inside. And Eleanor Price was about to find out why this house had been erased from existence. The house that remembered. Eleanor hesitated at the doorway. The air inside the house felt different, thicker, heavier, as if it carried the weight of something unseen. A faint smell of old wood and something metallic lingered in the air. The inside was untouched by time. A grand foyer stretched before her, its wooden floors polished, the high ceiling adorned with an antique chandelier. Dim, flickering bulbs cast long shadows against the wallpaper, an intricate pattern of twisting vines and roses. It was as if someone still lived here. Yet, there was no sound. No television hum, no creaking footsteps, no distant conversations. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She turned to leave. The door shut behind her. A rush of cold air whooshed past, like an invisible hand brushing against her skin. She spun around, gripping the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. Her chest tightened. "Hello?" she called out, her voice too small for the silence that swallowed it. No answer. No sound at all, just the distant tick, tick, tick of a clock. The photos on the wall. Eleanor took a step forward. She didn't want to. Her body moved on its own. The hallway stretched on both sides, lined with framed photographs, black and white, old and faded, their edges curled from time. She swallowed hard as she passed by them, her eyes scanning the faces in the frames. A young girl in a lace dress, standing alone in a vast, empty field. A family of 5, all dressed in formal clothing, their expressions unreadable. A man sitting on a rocking chair, staring directly at the camera, his eyes strangely intense. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Something about these photos felt wrong. Then, her breath hitched. Halfway down the hall, she stopped. There, hanging among the other portraits, was a photo of her. Taken recently, she was standing at the entrance of this house, wearing the same clothes she had on now. Her heart slammed against her ribs. This wasn't possible. This photo shouldn't exist. She reached out, her fingers barely brushing the frame. Then a whisper slipped through the silence. "You came back." Eleanor spun around. The hallway was empty. Her skin crawled. The air felt colder. She turned back to the photo, but it was gone. The space where it had been was now just an empty frame. Her breathing turned ragged. She was not alone here, the room that wasn't there. A sudden sound, a soft creak upstairs. Eleanor's head snapped toward the grand staircase at the end of the hall. Someone or something was moving above her. But the strangest part? The moment she heard it, a memory surfaced. She had been here before. She had walked up those stairs. And at the top, behind a locked door, something had been waiting. Her pulse thundered. The realization hit her like ice. She hadn't discovered this house. She had forgotten it, and now it was waiting for her to remember. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she traced the empty space where her own photo had been moments ago. She had seen it. She knew she had. Yet now, it was as if it had never existed. Something in this house was playing with her. Or worse, it knew her. Kriak, the sound of footsteps above her. Not the house settling. Not a trick of the wind. Someone was up there. She turned toward the staircase, a grand, spiraling structure of dark oak leading to the second floor. Each step groaned under her hesitant weight as she climbed, her breath shallow, heart hammering. She reached the landing and immediately noticed one door at the far end of the hallway. It was different from the others. Every other door was slightly ajar, showing glimpses of dusty, untouched rooms. But this door, it was shut, locked, and something inside her whispered, "You've opened it before." She wasn't sure if the thought was hers, or if it had been placed there. The scratches on the wood. Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes falling to the door's surface. Deep scratches lined the wood, not random ones. These were deliberate, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. A chill ran down her spine. Slowly, she reached for the handle. The moment her fingers brushed it, a thud sounded from inside. She jerked her hand away. Her lungs seized. The noise wasn't distant. It was right behind the door. Something was inside, and it knew she was here. She took a step back, and then, bang! The door shuddered violently. Eleanor stumbled, a scream catching in her throat. The air around her thickened, the hallway seeming to shrink, the walls pressing in. And then, the door unlocked, all by itself, with a slow, deliberate click. The handle turned, and the door began to open. Eleanor couldn't move. A sliver of darkness yawned beyond the widening gap. Then, she saw it. Something standing in the shadows. Not a person, not an animal. Something wrong, and then it moved. Straight toward her. The door creaked open so slowly that it felt like time itself had slowed down. Eleanor stood frozen, her back pressed against the wall, her pulse hammering like a drum inside her skull. At first, there was only darkness, a vast ink-black void inside the room beyond. But then, something shifted. A vague, twisted silhouette emerged from the darkness, barely visible against the dim light from the hallway. Not human. Not exactly. But the worst part? She knew it. Somewhere deep in the forgotten corners of her mind, her instincts screamed that she had seen this before. She just couldn't remember when, the room that shouldn't exist. The thing didn't rush at her. It just stood there, just inside the threshold, waiting. Eleanor's breath hitched. She should have run. Her body screamed for it, but she couldn't. Something kept her locked in place. A voice! No, not a voice. A thought that wasn't hers. Come in. The whisper curled in her mind like a slithering shadow. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a request. It was a memory. She had done this before. She had stepped inside this room. She had seen what was inside, and she had forgotten. Flashes of the past. The air around her grew thick and stifling, pressing against her skin like an unseen force. Then, in a sudden, horrifying wave, memories flooded her mind. Flashes, fragments. A young girl, standing in this very house, staring up at her with wide, terrified eyes. A whisper. Don't let it out. Blood, a dark stain seeping into the wooden floorboards, the door slamming shut. And then, screaming. Eleanor gasped, her knees nearly giving out as the vision shattered around her. The room beyond the door was pulling her in, but she knew. If she stepped inside, she might never come back out. The choice she didn't know she made. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the edge of the doorframe. A choice lay before her. Turn and run. Forget everything. Forget the house. Forget the past. Forget what she had done before. Step inside. Face the thing waiting for her. For the first time since she had entered the house, Eleanor felt a shift in control. She wasn't just a victim here. She had been a part of this before. And maybe the house was waiting for her to finish what she started. She took a step forward, and the door slammed shut behind her. The room where time stopped. Inside, the air was different. It wasn't just the darkness. It was wrong. The room was perfectly untouched. A Victorian-style bedroom, ornate furniture, a grand four-poster bed, elegant wallpaper. But it wasn't aged. It wasn't dusty. It was as if time had stopped here. And then Eleanor saw her, a girl standing in the corner. She was small, no more than 10 years old, wearing an old-fashioned white dress. And she was staring at Eleanor with hollow, empty eyes. Eleanor froze. The girl's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then, the whisper came again. Don't let it out. Eleanor's vision blurred. She had seen this girl before. She had been in this room before, and she had failed before. But failed at what? Then, the girl lifted her hand and pointed behind Eleanor. Eleanor turned, and her blood ran cold. There was a mirror on the far wall, except the reflection wasn't hers. Parvayaler. The reflection, that wasn't hers. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The mirror stood tall against the far wall, its golden frame intricate and ancient-looking, like something belonging in a museum. But the reflection inside it wasn't hers. It looked like her. Same auburn hair, same sharp cheekbones, same dark eyes. But the way it moved was wrong. When Eleanor inhaled, the reflection exhaled. When Eleanor lifted her hand, the reflection didn't. It just stood there, watching her. And then, it smiled. Not a normal smile, not something human. A slow, unnatural grin, stretching wider and wider until it was too much for any normal face. Eleanor staggered back. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. The girl in white hadn't moved from the corner. She simply watched, and then she spoke. You shouldn't have come back. The house that never forgot. Eleanor forced herself to breathe. Her mind was racing. Nothing about this was possible. Nothing about this was real. She turned to the girl, her voice barely above a whisper. What is this place? The girl's hollow gaze didn't waver. You know. Eleanor shook her head. I don't. I swear. I don't. The girl blinked slowly, as if considering whether to believe her. Then she lifted her hand again and pointed toward the mirror. You left it behind. Eleanor's pulse pounded. What did I leave? She demanded. The girl didn't answer. Instead, the mirror shimmered. The reflection that wasn't hers stepped forward. And then the bedroom door flung open. The corridor of the forgotten. The hallway beyond was no longer the house she had entered. The wallpaper peeled as if rotting, the ceiling sagged, and the air was thick with the scent of damp and decay. This was not the same house. Or maybe this was how it had always been. And her mind had been tricking her. Something inside her shifted. A memory surfaced. She had walked this hallway before. She had closed that door before. She had looked into that mirror before. And something had come out. Her hands trembled, her vision blurred. She staggered forward into the twisting, endless hallway. Doors lined the walls, all identical, all closed, except for one, at the very end of the hall, slightly ajar. And behind it, something was breathing, the door that should have stayed closed. Eleanor's feet moved against her will. The closer she got, the louder the breathing became. Not human, not an animal. Something else, something that had been waiting. She reached for the doorknob. The breathing stopped. Silence, and then a whisper from the other side. You brought me here. Eleanor's blood ran ice cold. No, that wasn't possible. She hadn't brought anything here. She hadn't even known this place existed until tonight. Except she had. The truth slammed into her like a freight train. She hadn't discovered this house by accident. She had been here before, and she had locked something inside this room. Her knees nearly buckled. It was waiting for her to remember, to let it out. And now she had. The door swung open, and Eleanor Price screamed. What was inside? She didn't see it, not at first, just a vast, empty darkness. The room beyond the door was wrong. It was endless, stretching beyond what should have been possible. And in the middle, a figure. Not quite human, not quite anything. Tall, unnatural, its limbs too long, its presence too heavy. And when it turned to look at her vision snapped, flashes of memory. A girl running through this house, screaming, a door slamming shut, a voice whispering, "You can't leave me here." And then the name, spoken in a voice that wasn't hers. Eleanor! A choked sob rose in her throat, because now she remembered everything. She had trapped it here, and it had never forgiven her. The final choice. The figure took a step toward her. Eleanor staggered back. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her skull. This was it. The moment where she decided what happened next. 1, she could run. But there was no escaping this house. It would always find her. 2, she could let it out, but the consequences would be unimaginable. 3, she could face what she had done. But that meant accepting the truth. The air turned suffocating. The thing in the darkness reached for her. And Eleanor made her choice. She stepped forward and whispered the last thing she ever wanted to say. I remember you. Then, the house shook. The walls collapsed inward, and everything went black. The house never lets go. The door swung open. Eleanor's lungs seized. Cold air whooshed past her, heavy with the scent of damp wood and something metallic. She took a step forward, not because she wanted to, but because the house pulled her in. Inside, the darkness was thick, suffocating. The walls breathed as if the house itself was alive, and in the center of the room, it stood waiting, the thing that was left behind. It wasn't fully visible, just a shadow, a stretched, unnatural figure barely outlined against the dim light leaking through the hallway. But Eleanor knew it. She didn't need to see its face, because she had seen it before, years ago, in this very house, and she had locked it inside. The whisper crawled up her spine. "You left me." Eleanor's vision swam. Memories crashed down on her like a storm. Flashes of a young girl, her younger self, standing in this same house, the room spinning, the walls bending, the thing screaming as she slammed the door shut. And then she had forgotten, but the house had not. The truth she had buried. Eleanor stumbled back, her mind racing. The house, it wasn't haunting her. It was remembering her, calling her back. She had done something terrible here, and it was time to face it. She turned back to the figure in the dark. And this time, she didn't look away. "Who are you?" she whispered. Silence. Then, a sudden bang behind her. She spun around. The door was gone. The entire hallway had vanished. There was no way out. She was trapped, just like before. The memory she never wanted. The figure moved closer. And this time, it stepped into the light. Eleanor stopped breathing, because the face staring back at her was her own. But not as she was now. It was her, younger, a child, maybe 10 or 11, with the same auburn hair, the same sharp cheekbones. But her eyes were different, hollow, dark, and filled with something Eleanor didn't want to name. The whisper came again. "You left me." Her chest tightened. No, this wasn't possible. But what if it was? What if this house wasn't haunted by some ghost, but by her? By the part of her she had buried so deep, she had forgotten it existed? The girl took another step closer. "You tried to erase me." Eleanor's pulse thundered. A feeling too strong to ignore crashed into her. This house was never just a house. It was her prison. And she was the one who built it. The choice that would decide everything. Eleanor felt her body tremble. She had locked this part of herself away. A memory too painful, too terrifying. Something she had wanted to erase completely. But it had never left her. The house was proof. It had waited. For her. For the day she would finally come back. For the day she would remember. The girl reached out. "Take me back." Eleanor's throat closed. She had a choice. 1, run. Leave this place. Forget again. 2, face the truth. Accept what she had buried. Her hands shook. Her mind screamed for her to run. But her heart told her it was time. So this time, she didn't run. This time she reached back. Her fingers brushed the girl's. And the house shattered. The house that wasn't there anymore. Eleanor gasped, her body jerking awake. She was outside, back on Langley Street. The rain was pouring again. Cars passed by. The city was alive. And the house was gone. There was nothing but an empty alley. As if it had never been there at all. She stared, breathless, heart pounding. But deep inside, she knew. The house wasn't gone. It was inside her now, waiting, watching, because some doors, once opened, never truly close. The end. Or is it? Final thoughts. This ending leaves the audience with an unanswered question. Was the house real, or just a part of Eleanor's mind? What did she lock away years ago? And now that it's free, what happens next? If this was a horror movie, the final shot would be Eleanor walking away. But just before the screen fades to black, she hears a whisper. "You never left me." End.